Good evening, folks. My name is Karen Sharp. I am here with Professor Randolph Hemmings. Today the professor will explain what science knows about the perception of racial traits.
Thank you, Karen. As you said, this is session C4, the perception of racial traits. No other living biologist is more respected and influential than Richard Dawkins, a scientist known for following the data, even when it takes surprising or counterintuitive paths. And yet, in The Ancestor's Tale, pages 407 to 408, Dawkins argues that the race notion is useful, though he knows that the concept cannot be defined, much less tested. Dawkins' reasoning? He claims that Westerners are consistent in classifying others by their race. He claims that this odd skill must reflect some sort of underlying reality despite the lack of objective evidence. He has a point. Most inhabitants of the New World are of mixed Afro-Euro-native ancestry. And most of them agree with Dawkins that race is dichotomous, and that a person's race is obvious to the eye. The problem with the claim is that they disagree strongly as to how many races there are, and just who is of which race. In short, Westerners imagine that they agree in how they racially classify others, even when this imagined agreement is easily disproved. Clearly, there is something strange going on here. This slide presentation covers 3 topics. 1. Why race is seen differently in different countries. 2. How US children learn to see race. 3. The human instinct to see otherness. Why is race seen differently in different countries? People of overwhelming sub-Saharan appearance are usually considered black throughout the Americas. And those showing the distinctive depigmentation of Northern Europeans are usually seen as white. For almost 400 years most Africans came to the Americas as slaves and most Europeans came as colonists. And so, although slavery ended about 150 years ago, an African appearance still correlates with socio-economic class throughout the hemisphere. Consequently, almost everyone in the New World today is confident of being able to observe whether someone is black or white. And yet, as Harry Hoetink, who spent his life studying this topic in the West Indies, explained, one and the same person may be considered white in the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, and colored in Jamaica or Martinique. This difference must be explained in terms of socially determined somatic norms. The same person may be called a Negro in Georgia. This must be explained by the historical evolution of social structure in the southern United States. The explanation lies in the varying appearance of each nation's yeoman class. Colonial Americas were slave societies. And, since ancient times, slave societies needed a large class of independent farmers who were exempt from the plantation economy. Called yeomen in medieval Europe, members of this class were granted freedom from forced labor. In return, they were tasked with taking up arms to crush any slave insurrection that arose. Slavery cannot survive in the absence of a large yeoman class. According to Hoetink, in every country the physical appearance of the yeoman class, the group who kept the slaves under military control, became the somatic norm image that eventually came to define who was white. In every nation, the line between white and black split yeomen from slaves. In Iberian colonies, the yeoman class comprised those of mixed Euro-Afro-Native American ancestry. So Latin Americans today label as white anyone of even partial Euro ancestry. In the British West Indies, with the exception of Barbados, the yeoman class was made up of mulattoes or maroons. So English-speaking West Indians distinguish between black and colored to this day. Finally, in the United States, the yeoman class was European. Poor white colonists were used for slave control. And so, even a slightly African appearance consigns you to the black side of the US color line to this day. Hoetink's somatic norm image theory stumbles a bit in conflating endogamous group membership designations, prevalent in former British and French colonies, with skin tone designations, prevalent in former Spanish and Portuguese colonies. But his central thesis is valid. It is easily demonstrated that when it comes to seeing race, people see only what they want to see. And what they want to see is learned from their culture in early childhood, Humans differ in countless physical traits: height, age, sex, beauty, slenderness. But only a handful of those traits are racialized, in that they suggest what race a person belongs to. There is no obvious reason why some physical traits are racialized in the US and not others. Why are tall people versus short not seen as different races? Furthermore, people of different cultures focus on different traits in identifying someone's race. Why is skin tone racialized in the US, but not in India? Yet racial perception seems to be universal and innate. Everyone does it, but no one can articulate just how they do it. Children learn to identify the race of strangers, using their own culture's rules, at about the same age that they learn to talk. Racial perception resembles other cognitive abilities identified by Piaget in 5 major aspects. First, like the ability to recognize that one jar can hold more liquid than another, some form of racial feature recognition appears in every culture. Second, contrary to folk belief, the ability begins to emerge in early childhood. Third, it forms in gradual stages. Fourth, with maturity it becomes so entrenched and cognitively automatic that the individual can no longer introspect how it is done. Finally, it eventually becomes rationalized into a theory-like knowledge structure that sustains inferences about category members that go beyond direct experience. On the other hand, racial perception differs in 2 ways from other early childhood skills. First, although the timing of development is stable across diverse cultures, the content, which features are racialized, varies dramatically. Second, although racial perception first appears in infancy, it becomes theory-like relatively late in childhood. Naive theories of biology, dogs beget puppies, cats beget kittens, of physics, big jars hold more than small jars, and of mind, mothers cannot really read thoughts, develop years earlier than do introspected theories of race. Once developed, racial perception is no longer entirely based upon observation. Instead, it comes to be seen as a form of group membership. The ability to see race appears in early childhood. Preschoolers presented only with spoken voices of nonsense words, and asked to match them with pictures, usually match English-sounding syllables with Euro features and Portuguese syllables with Afro features. Even African American kids do this. The most revealing experiments focus on hypodescent, the idea that, if you are partly black, you are all black. Second graders, 6th graders, and young adults are presented with pictures of an interracial couple, one Afro-looking, one Euro-looking, pushing a stroller containing a baby that is so bundled up as to be utterly concealed. A week later, after memories fade, they are asked which parent the unseen infant most resembled. 2nd graders choose randomly. Half imagine that the baby resembled the Euro-looking parent and half say that it resembled the Afro-looking parent. 6th graders overwhelmingly say that the infant resembled the Afro-looking parent. But when asked why the hidden baby had come out looking black, 6th graders simply shrug. Young adults also overwhelmingly say that the concealed baby had looked black. But when asked why this was so, they confabulate stories of dominant and recessive genes in order to rationalize their culture's counterfactual folklore of hypodescent. Again, in no experiment is there any correlation with the subject's own endogamous group membership or ethnic self-identity. Black and white Americans of every age answer the same way. Children of every culture can correctly for their society categorize strangers by age 3. They can match each category with its correct word by age 5. US children internalize their culture's counterfactual hypodescent rule by age 10. They can confabulate an intellectual rationalization for hypodescent by high school. The most astonishing finding is the first. Although racial categories and their defining traits vary dramatically among cultures, children everywhere learn their own culture's rules and categories shortly after learning to walk. The cognitive system to recognize race, however each culture defines it, is as adaptable to culture, and yet is as hardwired in the brain, as is language itself. Unquestionably, it must have been as powerfully selected for as was language itself. And yet, racial traits vary geographically so imperceptibly on the scale of a few hundred miles, that until just a few millennia ago, when most humans invented agriculture, no one could ever have seen someone of a different race. How can the cognitive ability to perceive racial categories be so strongly adaptive, if the occasion to use it never arose? Note the adaptation to thermal stress in the picture. Tropic selects for tall and slender, Arctic selects for short and stocky. The answer is revealed in a series of experiments conducted by Robert Kurzban, John Tooby and Leda Cosmides. Sex, age, and otherness are the three fundamental attributes that the mind records reliably. Long after memory has faded of the occupation, name, or clothing of a stranger to which you were briefly exposed, you can recall that it was a white woman or a black male child. But age and sex seem to be independent of culture. Otherness is not. The ability to recall a stranger's otherness actually detects kinship or alliances. Over the past 100 millennia or so, humans have become adept at detecting competing social groups. Facial features enable a child to identify whether someone is genetically related within the child's extended family. The ability is selected for because one is less likely to be killed and devoured by a relative than by a member of a competing group. This point is often misunderstood. It has even been reported that humans are hardwired to recognize race. Not so. Humans are hardwired to detect otherness as defined by each individual's own culture. In America, due to colonial history, this means distinguishing among those of mostly African ancestry, European ancestry, and Native American ancestry. In other lands, it means distinguishing by religion or language. And with that I conclude today's presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Hemmings. I am confused on one point. You said that identifying others by their race is not an inborn human instinct. But you also said that every culture does it. I certainly do it all the time. I do not think that anyone can help doing it. Thinking back on my studies, I learned that when every culture does something, it is the very definition of instinct.
Excellent question. The best answer I can give goes back to the language analogy. Humans have a strong instinct to speak a language. In fact, starting with Noam Chomsky, researchers have identified specific features common to all languages. Those features, as well as the drive to speak, are probably hardwired. Similarly, humans have a strong drive and ability to recognize those who are not members of their own tribe. This is also probably innate. But the specific language that an infant learns is not inborn. It depends entirely on its cultural environment. Similarly, the specific traits that a child learns to associate with tribal membership is not inborn. They depend on its cultural environment.
Thank you, Professor. I am going to have to think about that some more. I may come back and ask about this again later on. And that is our time for today, ladies and gentlemen. This is Karen Sharp.
And Randolph Hemmings.
Signing off until next time.